Item number 18, public hearing number 1 to receive input from community regarding a district-based election system for the city council. This will be also presented by Dave Vaughn, and we also will have another individual, Mr. Robert McIntyre from the National Demographics Corporation.
Good evening. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Mayor, Council, this evening. Tonight is the first public hearing in a series of public hearings required as the City Council considers moving to by-district elections. I know during your previous board meeting you received a rather thorough briefing on the how and why, so we won't dig too deep into that. The purpose of tonight's meeting is really more about engaging the council and the community around the concepts of neighborhoods and communities of interest. So that way, when we move toward the second public hearing, which is also a pre-draft map training meeting, that the community starts to build a base of knowledge, and when we release the state demographic data for your neighborhood, your area, your city boundaries, that hopefully community members, if they're so inclined, will opt to propose maps for your consideration. And so with that, we're just going to walk through a little bit of the districting process. Now, this actually, the timeline came right out of your prior meeting notes from this, and so tonight we have the first public hearing. And just last night, we're talking like 5 minutes till midnight, the state released the demographic data for the statewide database. And so when I made this presentation, we still hadn't received it at 6 p.m. And so I had given up for the night and decided to spend some time with my kids. And lo and behold, what do you know, the state kept their promise at the very last minute. So we at National Demographics will be spending the next 3 to 4 weeks trying to get all of this data out to the 400 plus clients that we're currently working with to do this. And that's not to try to lower expectations too much, just to let you know that there's a big demand, and there are some agencies that have the requirement to complete this process a little sooner than yours does, and so they would be prioritized. And so with that in mind, you currently have the second public hearing scheduled for October 5th. I would propose, working through council and your city manager, that we look at maybe pushing that back to the following council meeting. And then similarly, that would push back any subsequent meeting. But just looking at the process as you had it defined in your last meeting, the second public hearing is also a pre-draft map hearing meeting, and it's really meant to train your community, because you as electeds are professionals in this kind of stuff, but the local community is not. They see this, at election time or at the decennial, like we're seeing now, and so it's an opportunity for them to get up to speed and learn the language that you've already likely mastered through your careers. So after the second draft map, or after the second pre-draft map meeting, we would release the data. We would release any mapping tools that the City Council would like to make available to the local community. And we would ask that if the community is going to submit maps, they need to do that in time for us to process those maps in time for the third draft map hearing. And so we have a date here according to your original schedule. Like I said, we're hoping all these can be pushed out one meeting date at least. In time for the third draft map hearing, presently scheduled for November 2nd. At this meeting, we would take all the submitted maps that were submitted, at least a week earlier, by the 26th of October, according to the prior schedule, process them, make them available on your city's website, and then they would also be analyzed by us to say, okay, do these maps meet all the legal requirements, some of which we're going to talk about in just a couple slides here. Do they not? What are some of the criteria, or what are some of the factors that the people who submitted maps were considering? Because one of the things you often see when people submit maps is they just care about their part of town, or they have one particular issue they're trying to deal with. So they may not draw a legally compliant map that you could adopt, but they may have input for you to consider when you're looking at all of the maps before you adopt one, and that can be valuable as well. Then we would take direction. We would usually, the third meeting is probably the most vigorous public engagement part of this process, because there's something tangible to talk about, submitted maps. And so that provides an opportunity for the community to weigh in on all the maps that were submitted, but also for you to discuss what's before you, what you like, what you don't like, because in the end, you, the council, picked the map along with the sequencing. And so Not uncommon, what we would see is if there was a lot of maps submitted, I would group them in ways that were logical and easy to follow. So you could, there maybe we'd be looking at 3 or 4 types of maps, even though there may be considerably more, if there is. And then we would talk through the pros and cons. You would hear the public weigh in, and then you might give me direction saying, Robert, NDC, we'd like to see you take these types of maps and make these sorts of adjustments and bring them back for the 4th meeting. The goal is to narrow these down. So by the 4th meeting, hopefully you have a level of comfort with selecting a map that you'd want to move forward with, along with the sequencing that would be attached to that. And so that would be the goal by the end of public hearing number 4. You could, for example, narrow it down to 1 map at the end of 4 and say, bring it back for adoption with these minor tweaks. That can be done as well. But like I said, the goal is to start big and work our way down, hopefully. Now, here's the real purpose of tonight, of why you have to have these pre-draft meetings, is to help people understand some of the redistricting goals and rules around drawing maps. First, we have the federal laws. The federal law says that we must try to draw maps that have relatively equal population, total population. We're not talking adults, voters. We're talking total population within each district. And so our goal is to make those districts as close as possible in size as we can. Now, of course, I saw that there was plans for infill and development. That doesn't mean we have to make them perfectly equal. If you have a community development plan where certain part of town is going to be filling with residents soon, then you can underweight that area and overweight the other areas. But there are maximums we can do that. The difference between your highest population and your lowest population council districts can't exceed a 10% deviation from the mean. So, and we'll help you when we do the demographics on the maps that are submitted. We'll tell you how far they are off the mean and if they meet the legal requirements. So you won't have to divine that. We will be very explicit for you on that. We also have to make sure the 4 tenets of the Federal Voting Rights Act are being observed, and that there's no racial gerrymandering in the maps that are drawn. The California criteria for cities includes things that you might expect it to include. So for example, you'd want districts to be geographically contiguous when possible. You have a unique shaped community that can provide some challenges for that, but you want, to the extent that it's possible, you want to have geographically contiguous districts. You also want to keep neighborhoods and communities of interest together. And so what does that mean? It means you don't break apart one neighborhood to go grab other voters and then kind of have one of the, a finger going out to grab a specific group when you could have kept a neighborhood or community together. And so that is one of the state requirements. You also want to use easily identifiable boundaries. Now, to the extent you can, because we're constantly balancing population. And so you want to use major roads, highways, arteries, rivers, railroad tracks, obvious things that when somebody looks at it and says, that would make a natural splitting point. But once again, we still have to go back to those federal laws and balance population. So you may use major arteries here in town for most of your dividing lines, but they'll come near the edges when we're doing population balancing. Very often where we'll see we're going down some smaller streets that may not be as obvious, but hopefully easy to follow for the voters in those areas. And then of course we want to draw districts that are compact. When you think of compact, think of like a perfect circle as the most compact you can draw a district. Now, obviously, when we draw census boundaries and we make our neighborhoods, we don't make them, those are more rectangulars and squares. So it's a little hard to get a perfect circle, but we don't want those fingers reaching out, like we talked about in the other case. We talked about excluding one, breaking up a neighborhood. Here we're talking about we don't want fingers reaching out. We want to grab chunks in a way that keeps it nice and compact. And then, of course, you cannot favor or discriminate against a political party. So you can't use the political affiliation. We don't look at past voting data within your area. So we look at who voted, but we don't look at who they voted for. It's not in our database that we're analyzing. And so we cannot discriminate for or against a political party. And then some of the other traditional redistricting principles that some jurisdictions choose to acknowledge is following the will, or at least acknowledging the will of the voters at the last election. Typically there are people who want to engage in this process because they're really interested in promoting democracy, or there's people who may have have a reason to want to put every council member together in one seat, because it's easier to deal with that than mount a recall or run for office, so to speak. And so we just want to recognize that, the electors or the citizens put you in office, and they should decide whether you come or go, not my pen, drawing a map. And so that is another consideration that as a council you can take in. And then, of course, I mentioned the future population growth, so long as we're not under or overpopulating areas that cause the balance to be more than 10% variance. So there's not a lot of people in the room, but I see that people are sending in electronically, and they're calling in, and they're sending emails. So this part becomes very relevant, because what we want to hear from your community is what are your neighborhoods? So what geographic areas do they consider to be their neighborhoods? And some examples of neighborhoods could include things like natural dividing lines, like highways or major roads, rivers, canals. Areas around parks. You spend a lot of time talking about parks, and I'll bet the communities around those parks have an affinity for them, because clearly they're well maintained and taken care of, and you take a lot of pride in this community around those parks. And so, that could be another type of thing that defines a neighborhood. Other landmarks could be included as well. And so we do ask for some information from your public works that helps document some of this information. I was even taking notes to ask for your evacuation map as the way that you're currently dividing certain types of neighborhoods, or bringing together certain types of neighborhoods for the point of evacuations. That's just one thing to consider. But I'm hoping that through communication from the community, that you, the council, and it will get back to us, what your community considers to be their neighborhoods. And so that's one thing we're looking to hear about. So we can also, NDC, your demographer, can also draw you maps. Just in case nobody submits some, we want to make sure you have options to choose from and give us feedback on. The second area to look at is the communities of interest. Now first, let's talk about what communities of interest are not. They do not include relationships to political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. Those are not communities of interest. Really, communities of interest can be defined around just about anything other than political affiliation and race. So if there's a group of people who bought houses together and they went to the same high school or college, that's great. If they share, for example, a social or an economic interest, we'd want to know about that. One of the things we see in certain parts of the state, for example, is when there are senior centers. Often some of these senior centers, you think of those Del Webb communities, they're huge, and they have lots and lots of seniors. Well, those communities very often want to be split in two, so they feel like they have two council members who have to answer to them, because they want to have a strong voting bloc. And so, sometimes communities of interest want to be kept together to maximize their voting strength, or they may want to be split apart depending on how they feel like that would impact their ability to contribute to the democratic process. So we would also like to hear from your community around what they determine to be their communities of interest here in town, and that will help us also put together different district boundaries and do our best to keep those whole as best we can, while also balancing the equal population clause. And then, of course, if those communities would like to be kept whole or broken up, it's good for them to let us know that as well, because we wouldn't know unless they told us. And so we're hoping to hear back from your community if tonight, and whether it be electronically or at future meetings, what they consider to be their neighborhoods and communities of interest. And so with that, I'm available to answer any questions.
All right, thank you for the presentation and the opportunity to ask questions from the council. Anybody?
Through the mayor?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that first of all, there's an interest in public participation on this, and these maps will be posted on the city's website. Will the addresses of the current city council be on that website?
So what we do is typically put the census block that the members live in, not the actual home address. And so a census block will have many, many houses, unless you just happen to live in a census block that only has one home in it. But typically we would include the census block that each of the council members lives in.
So if I don't understand you correctly, I'm looking at a block.
Yes.
So the community will just assume that somewhere in that block, that's where one of us lives.
It was, so typically we would highlight it and it would have the council member that lives in that block, but the block is not small. It wouldn't be like one city block. It's like a census block is multiple city blocks typically.
Okay, and second question, this process will be updated in 2030, the next census?
Every 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Sean? Good. Grace? All right. Anybody from the public with a question? Anybody online with a question?
No public comment.
Okay. All right. Hold on. Hold on, I've got to do something here.
Public hearing.
I have to have a public hearing. So if you have a question, go for it.
Going back a couple of slides with your timeline, I just want to double check. You go one more, go to slide 3. Should that be November 16th, not December 16th on the 2nd? As you were rolling them down through there?
That would certainly make sense because it
Okay.
would be difficult to adopt your ordinance on December 7th otherwise.
Just wanted to make sure because December 16th is my anniversary and I will not be at a meeting. So I just wanted to make sure I read that, you know.
I'm sure your spouse will be happy to hear that you have your priorities straight.
Thank you.
All right. Public hearing number 1 regarding a district-based election system for the city council is now open. If there are any members of the public who would like to address the council on this issue, please provide your statement via public comment and state your name and address for the record. So once again, I will ask, is there anybody here that would like to speak? Is there anybody online?
Still no.
Okay. Hearing no further comment on this issue, I am closing the public hearing, bringing the matter back to the council.
Through the mayor,
Yes.
I like to make a motion, we hold.
I don't know that we have action, do we, Shannon?
We don't have to take any action at this point, but I believe the city manager does have a comment.
Okay.
So through the mayor, we will take this information and promote it onto our website so folks know that we're doing this on a public basis, and we'll take the information that was provided and we'll ensure that we get it out to as much of the public as we possibly can.
Thank you, sir. All right.